Well, hello, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us. We're going to be having a presentation on New Rochelle and the artist community that developed. I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Larry Sheldon. I'm the local history librarian here at the New Rochelle Public Library, and I am also in charge of all the digital imagery that we have collections of. Please, I'd like to request to hold all questions until the end of the program, and we will try to answer any questions that you do have. So basically, the way this presentation is going to develop is I'm going to discuss what were the circumstances that fostered the development of New Rochelle and an artist community. And we're going to then go on to the New Rochelle Art Association and its relationship with the New Rochelle Public Library. And lastly, we are going to briefly discuss an array of some of the artists that had lived and worked in New Rochelle. We are concentrating on artists who lived and worked here from the 1900s through the 1950s. Of course, there's still a very active artist community in New Rochelle, but we had to make a cutoff point at some, and that is where I decided to stop. So the first thing that we're going to deal with is the rise of an artist community in New Rochelle. And why would this have happened during the period of the 19th century? Well, during the 19th century, it was a great period of invention. One of the major inventions of the period was the steamboat. And what the steamboat provided was access to people from Long Island and the city to come to New Rochelle. And with that happening, you saw the development of resorts along Long Island Sound, and many of the wealthy New Yorkers who discovered New Rochelle built summer homes in New Rochelle, particularly in the Davenport area. In 1860, New Rochelle had a population of 4,000. By 1920, the population expanded to 36,000. And by 1930, there were 54,000 residents living in New Rochelle. And part of the reason that this growth occurred also would have been because by 1872, we had a dependable rail system to get to New Rochelle to the city. And because of this, among the many people who moved to New Rochelle, among them were a great deal of performing artists, visual artists, movie producers. And being so close to New York had a lot to offer these people. It was the publication center of the country. We had Broadway, you had museums, you had galleries, vaudeville, and all sorts of other theaters. This period also was known as the golden age of illustration. And this was another technological marvel that occurred during this period. It was the development of the commercial lithographic press. And with the commercial lithographic press, all of a sudden, artwork could be reproduced accurately and inexpensively in magazines, newspapers, and would make its way into everybody's house. And because of this, you had a lot of illustrators who made their way and lived in New Rochelle. And the newspaper publishers were also a very bright bunch of people. They realized that these images were a way of increasing readership to their publications. So many of these publications would hire comic artists, and illustrators to be part of the everyday productions of their materials. By 1920, a significant amount of the illustrations that were being done in national periodicals and 90% of the illustrations of the Saturday Evening Post were being done by artists who lived in New Rochelle. In this slide, we see a picture of some of the people that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. Starting in the upper left hand, we see Edward Tannhauser. Tannhauser was the developer of one of the earliest and first motion picture studios which resided in New Rochelle. Next to Mr. Tannhauser is Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell and his Saturday Evening Post covers are iconic images that permeated American life. Next to Mr. Rockwell is Nell Brinkley. Nell Brinkley had a 40-year career as a comic and illustrator artist. She was known as the Queen of Comics and created an iconic image that you may have heard of called the Brinkley Girl. And we'll discuss a little bit about the Brinkley Girl later on. Next to Nell is Eddie Foy Sr. Eddie Foy was a vaudevillian and motion picture actor. On the bottom left, we have a publicity photo that shows Ella Belle Davis, a native New Rochellian who was an opera singer and performer extraordinaire. Next to Ella Belle is Pearl Primus. Not as well known, but she was a very well-known dancer, choreographer, and social activist. Next to Primus are Irene and Vernon Castle. They were a well-known dancing couple who performed in vaudeville, on stage, and in the movies, as well as having a dancing school. And last but not least is the iconic Claire Briggs. Claire Briggs was a comic artist. During his heyday, he was probably the highest paid comic artist in the country. He was produced in over 180 publications and had a readership of over 2 million people a day. Because of all the artists that lived in New Rochelle, it was quite natural that they had soirees and get-togethers. And at one of these get-togethers in 1912, at the studio of Alta West Salisbury, the New Rochelle Art Association was formed. In 1921, the New Rochelle Art Association came up with the idea of creating interesting signposts or approach signs that are located throughout the city of New Rochelle. And over here, we see a photograph from the Herald Tribune that shows some of these artists, and they're seated outside of the home of Claire Briggs, in what's called Blue Anchor, which was located in New Rochelle. The artists in the portrayed here are from, I'm going to go from the man sitting towards the standing figures, then back down to the sitting. So we have Remington Schuyler, who's sitting down. Above him is an older gentleman looking over him. That's George Tobin. George Tobin was one of the founding members of the New Rochelle Art Association. Next to him is Ralph E. Robertson. Then there's Norman Rockwell and James Marsh. Sitting now, we have Frederick Dana Marsh, Coles Phillips, Edward Penfield, and Claire Briggs. Oops, I'm sorry. What we have over here is the blueprint for all of the approach signs that were produced for New Rochelle. And on this, we see the specifications of the signs, the artist that was going to do the signs, and the intended locations of the sign. It also provided a record of what the signs were made, so if any repairs ever had to be done, they could be done according to the specs. Because of these signs, many cities around the country actually began to follow suit and began making street approach signs that were more interesting than as opposed to just saying entering Oshkosh, Wisconsin. So now I'm going to show you all of the signs and the artists who did them and where they're located. The first sign that we're looking at is the Claire Briggs signpost. And that sign is located on Kings Highway at the Pelham border. If you look at the sign, it's a gentleman with his dogs. And the inscription on the sign reads, "The place to come when feller needs a friend." The next sign that I'm showing you is one that was designed by Norman Rockwell. And that is located on Eastchester Road and Pelhamdale Avenue. It depicts the Minutemen during the Revolution. And the sign's inscription is "Rich in History." And I want you to remember "Rich in History" because this is going to come up later in some of the documents that we have of Norman Rockwell. Here we have George Tobin's sign, and it's a picture of the Huguenots landing in New Rochelle. This sign is located on Webster Avenue at the Eastchester line. It's inscribed, "Settled by the Huguenots, 1688. Here we now have the James Marsh sign. This sign is located on Pelham Road at the Pelham border. In it, we see a picture of a boat entering La Rochelle Harbor in France, which is where many of the Huguenots came from who settled in New York, and that is how New Rochelle got its name. The inscription on this sign is "Settled in 1688 by the Huguenots of La Rochelle." The next sign that we see here was designed by Robert F. Robertson, which is on Lincoln Avenue at the Pelham line. It's a depiction of houses in a neighborhood. And its inscription is "The Hometown." Here we see Coles Phillips sign, which is located at the intersection of North Avenue and Wilmot Road. And it's a picture of General Howe leading the British troops to the Battle of White Plains. The inscription on the sign reads, "Passing of the British under General Howe, October 18th, 1776. Here we have Edward Penfield's sign. Edward Penfield was a well-known illustrator and is considered the father of the American poster. This sign located on Boston Post Road and the Pelham Manor border. It depicts a stagecoach going down Post Road. And it's a mileage marker which states 17 miles to New York. Here we have Remington Schuyler's sign. Remington Schuyler was a painter and illustrator and received his name after the well-known artist Frederick Remington, who also happened to be a New Rochelle resident and had his studio in town here. This approach sign is at the Boston Post Road, Larchmont border, and it depicts what I'm guessing to be the Sewanee Indians, who were the natives of this region, coming back from a hunt. And the sign has its inscription, founded by the Huguenots, 1688. Here we have a sign by Lawrence Loeb, a well-known American architect. And this sign is located on Weaver Street near Quaker Ridge Road at the Mamaroneck borderline. It's entitled City of Homes, Churches, and Schools, and it shows as its imagery a church, a school, and a home. Lastly, we have the Frederick Dana March sign. He moved to New Rochelle in 1914, and this sign is located at Cooper's Corner on North Avenue. And it depicts the boat that the Huguenots sailed from to New Rochelle. Now I'm going to go and discuss the artists and their relationship with the New Rochelle Public Library. I mentioned earlier that the New Rochelle Art Association was founded in 1912, and in 1914, the New Rochelle Art Association sponsored an exhibition to celebrate the opening of the new New Rochelle Public Library building, which was located on Main Street and Pintard Avenue. The building is still standing. And in the show, there were over 140 entries. And among the artists who participated were Remington Schuyler, Norman Rockwell, Joseph Langendecker, Glenn Newell. The picture on the screen shows the exhibition hall in the library in 1938. 1938 was a very big year for New Rochelle because that's when New Rochelle celebrated its 250th anniversary. So a lot of the images that you're going to see are from events that strictly correlate to this event. In this slide, we see the current New Rochelle Public Library building, which opened in 1979. This is the view from Ruby D. Park. And if you look to the left, you see a stone sculpture. The title of the sculpture is Flame of Knowledge and was done by the artist Luman Martin Winter. Luman Winter was a president of the New Rochelle Art Association. When the New Rochelle Public Library building was built here, the lobby space was also designed to be a gallery space. And this gallery space became a place for the New Rochelle Art Association to hold exhibits. And in 1982, after the passing of Luman Winter, the gallery space officially became the Luman Winter Gallery. And now, because of this, the New Rochelle Art Association had a large permanent gallery space to hold their exhibitions. One of the artists who had a very close relationship with the library was Norman Rockwell. Here we see a picture of Norman Rockwell sitting on the stoop of his home, 24 Lord Kirshner Road, I'm sorry. And he resided in this house first with his first wife, Irene, from 1926 to 29, and then with his second wife, Mary, from 1929 to 39. And at that point, the Rockwells moved to Arlington, Vermont. Here we see a picture of Rockwell's painting Land of Enchantment, which he gave to the New Rochelle Public Library, as it is sitting above an exhibition of Music Week that was held in the children's room in 1938. Here we see the current location of the Land of Enchantment in our children's room today. What I have here is a copy of a letter that Norman Rockwell sent endorsing the building of a history center for New Rochelle. Remember his sign from 1923, Rich in History? This is a follow-through to that. And it is because of this endorsement, we had the building of the local history room in the New Rochelle Public Library in 1938. For the dedication of this room, there were 63 radiotone photographs etched on copper plates. They were framed by American Legion Post number 8 of New Rochelle, and they were to memorialize the soldiers that lost their lives in New Rochellians who lost their lives during World War I. The ones that I have pictured here from left to right are David Peake, Reuben Abrams, and Walter Brown. The next artist that I'm showing who had a very close relationship with the library, and here we have pictures of him at work in the library, was Ugo Mochi. Mochi moved to New Rochelle in 1928 with his wife, an opera singer, and Mochi lived in New Rochelle for the remainder of his days. Pictured on the lower left, we see Mochi explaining and showing some of his illustrations from a display case to the director of the library at that time, Ruth Phillips. To the right, we have a picture of Mochi going through the picture files, which were on the second floor of the library. I don't know if any of you people here remember the picture file cabinets that we had in the library. Prior to the internet, we had a huge collection of images that we would loan out to people, artists, and they would use these for practicing or seeing things in historical context, or even displaying in their house for little periods of time. In 1943, a reading room at the library, which was still located on Main Street and Pintard Avenue, was developed. And 8 artists were incorporated, and they made panels to help decorate the room. And I'm going to show you the artwork that was part of that room. The first image on the left is by Walter Beach Humphrey, and it's of what we believe to be Saint Jerome, who was the patron saint of libraries. The picture next to it by Harold Anderson is of Santa Claus with 6 others. Of course, these are descriptive titles, as we just truly have no other information as to what they are. Next, we have a canal scene by Orson Lowell, and next to it is a winter scene by Ernest Thornton Thompson. Here we see a landscape by Charles Kingham and an R. Emmett Owen winter landscape with a covered bridge. Here is Revere Wistenhoff's still life with book and candle and Herbert Cates landscape. And what I consider 2 of the most interesting images that are in this group, we have Courtney Allen's B-17s in flight. Of course, this was done during World War II, so it's understandable that this would be a part of her imagery. And Ugo Mochi's 2 figures with horse-drawn cart. I don't know if you were able to notice when I showed you the picture of Ugo Mochi and his illustrations, his artwork, it was famous for doing things in silhouette. And this is what we have in this image. And last but not least is the home of Mary Huntington, which was painted by George Tobin, a founding member of the New Rochelle Art Association. All of these panels are in the archives and are being preserved. One of the most interesting projects that the New Rochelle Art Association had gotten involved with was during World War II in conjunction with the USO. Artists from around the country were recruited to sketch portraits of service personnel at USO centers. Beginning in 1943, over 2,000 personnel who were stationed at Fort Slocum, Davis Island. Most of these portraits were done at the Masonic Temple located on Main Street and LeConte Place. These drawings were then done and a note was sent, and the originals were sent off to people of choice of the sitters of these photographs, of these sketches. These images were cataloged and put into a scrapbook, which we see 2 images of over here. And in these images, we see how they are cataloged. We see the copy of the sketches that were made, the date, an inventory number, who the personnel were, to whom the sketches were sent, and who the artist was. These 11 scrapbooks are preserved today in our archives at the library. Now I'm going to go into a little bit of the biography of a group of artists that I had been speaking about. The first and probably most famous artist of the group is Norman Rockwell, whose artwork was brought into people's homes through Saturday evening post covers. And these images became part of the fabric of our everyday life. Rockwell lived in New Rochelle from 1913 through 1939. In this slide, the building on the left we see is Brown's Lodge. Was a boarding house that was located on Prospect Street between Center and South Division. And this was the first home of Norman Rockwell, where he lived with his parents, where they came in 1913. Another early home of the Rockwells was another boarding house, Edgewood Hall, which was located on Lockwood Avenue off of Webster. Here's a picture of one of Rockwell's early studios. It was a studio built on top of a garage behind Brown Lodge. Brown Lodge and where the studio was, these buildings were torn down, and it is currently the site of the Prospect Street parking lot. Here, I am going to show a couple of iconic images by Norman Rockwell. The group of 4 images on the left were 4 posters that were created by Rockwell to be a way of raising money for our forces in World War II and asking people to buy savings bonds. This series was known as the 4 Freedoms. Next to it, we see a painting that also did make its way to a Saturday Evening Post cover. And the title of that painting is Runaway and Police Officer. And next to it, we see a Saturday Evening Post cover from November 8th, 1924, entitled Army March or Grand Reception. Not quite sure why Grand Reception, but if anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear them. The next artist who I'd like to speak about is Nell Brinkley. Brinkley was an illustrator and comic artist who was, as I mentioned, was referred to as the Queen of Comics. She was the creator of the Brinkley Girl, which the image on the left we see is the curly-haired woman. This woman became so iconic, it became part of song and theater, and it actually replaced the Charles Dana Gibson's Gibson Girl as the image of America. Brinkley came to New York at the behest of the media mogul William Randolph Hearst. He convinced her to come to New York, and she settled in Brooklyn from Denver. She later joined the group of illustrators that were living in New Rochelle and lived at the residence at 56 Prior Terrace with her husband, Bruce McCrae, a New Rochelle resident. Here we see a couple of pictures of the American Weekly. The American Weekly was a Sunday supplement that was included in our newspapers. And some of the artists from New Rochelle who had covers and work in this were Norman Rockwell and Orson Lowell. The image on the left, which we see, is a story entitled The Fortunes of Hossy. And Hossy, of course, is one of Brinkley's girls dressed in flapper attire. And next to it is In the Days of King Arthur, and the illustrations for this, of course, were done by Brinkley. Now, I'd like to tell you a little about Claire Briggs. Claire Briggs, as I mentioned, was a comic artist, and he rose to fame in 1904 with his comic strip, A Piker Clerk. And as I mentioned, by 1920, he was reported to be the highest paid cartoonist in the country. Many of Briggs's comics involved his beloved game of golf, and he joined the Waikigill Country Club in 1914, which is why he built his house across the street from that. Here is a book by Claire Briggs entitled Golf from 1916, and it contains a selection of his cartoons of people playing golf. If anybody is interested in seeing this book, it is in our local history collection and is available for people to look at. In this slide, we see a picture of Briggs's home, Blue Anchor, which was located at 1 Byworth Road. The house was built in 1917 and was designed by the architect Henry Morse. To build the house, Briggs went to a shipyard and bought timbers from salvaged vessel, an 18th century salvaged vessel. Also, what he purchased there was a blue anchor, which he put into the basement of the house, and that is what the house got its name. A matter of fact, the anchor still is in the house today. Two other famous illustrators from New York are the Leyendecker brothers, Frank X and Joseph C. The Leyendecker family immigrated to this country from Germany in 1882, and they settled in Chicago. 20 years later, the father brought the family to New Rochelle, where he began working in one of the local breweries. Here, I'm going to show you some of the iconic type of imagery that Joseph Leyendecker did. On the left is a Saturday Evening Post cover, and it portrays members of a crew team carrying the boat on their shoulders. Next to that is the Arrow Collar Man reading a book from 1916. And next to that is Alden, the Arrow Collar Man ad from 1922. Leyendecker made the Arrow Collar and Arrow Collar Men famous. He was responsible for this advertisement. He produced the ads here from 1907 through 1931. And the Arrow Collar Men, as they were called, were the male models who were used to portray the shirts, and at the time, the detachable collars that were part of the shirts. Here we have some of the imagery that was done by Frank Leyendecker. The first one is a February 2nd, 1922 cover from Life magazine entitled Flapper. In the middle, we have a November 4th, 1914 cover of Vanity Fair of Harlequin. The Harlequin was a repeated theme in Frank Leyendecker's work. He was particularly fascinated and a big fan of the French performer Poirot. The last is a cover from Ladies' World, October 1908. And it has a picture of a couple on their honeymoon. Pictured here is the Leyendecker house, which is situated on Mount Tom Road. The house today is currently the Mount Tom Day School and Summer Camp. Joseph purchased the land for this house in 1914, and he built this mansion. He built a wing on the mansion, which you can see on the right-hand side, which was set aside to be a studio and apartment for his brother Frank. And John lived in the main house, with his secretary and companion, Charles Beach. Probably the second most famous artist who resided and worked in New Rochelle was Frederick Remington. Here we have a picture of the house that he moved into in 1892 that was named Endion. I'm not sure where the name came from, and I apologize for that. It was designed by the architect Alexander Jackson Davis and was located on 301 Webster Avenue, just off of Colonial Place, in a section that was called at the time Lathers Hill. He remained in this home and studio until 1909, when he moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut. Many artists and also lived in this development in Lathers Hill. Among them were the playwright Augustus Thomas, the stage actor Francis Wilson, writer and journalist Julian Hawthorne, and the illustrator Edward Kemble. Kemble was known as the illustrator for the first edition of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In this picture, we see the interior of Frederick Remington in his studio and his iconic imagery. He loved to draw and work with cowboys, and the next one is the cavalry. These are recurring themes in almost all of his work. These images and drawings used to appear in such magazines as Harper's Weekly and Collier's Magazine. Here we see two of Remington's iconic pieces that are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Both of these were done in his studio in New Rochelle. The first one you see on the left is Bronco Buster, which was done after an illustration that appeared in Collier's called Pitching Bronco. And the painting is on the Southern Plains, and of course it is of the cavalry riding. One of the many studios to be built in New Rochelle was Terrytoon Studios by the cartoonist Paul Terry. Paul Terry moved to New Rochelle, his studio, in 1931. And his first studio was set up at 271 North Avenue, the K Building. The picture on the left shows Paul working at his desk at the K Building studio. On the right is the second studio where they moved to in 1950. And you see the sign Terrytoons and its iconic character, Mighty Mouse. Here we see a picture from Paul Terry's obituary. And in the picture, you see him with a cutout of Mighty Mouse. Next to that are two other characters that he is well known for, Heckle and Jekyll, and another character that you may have heard of, Deputy Dog and Muskrat. Next I want to talk about is Vernon and Irene Castle, a husband and wife dance team. They appeared on Broadway and in silent film. Irene was born in New Rochelle in 1893. And in 1910, at a function at the New Rochelle Rowing Club, happened to meet Vernon Castle. Vernon was able to get her first professional dance performance, though a small part, in the Summer Widows. They were married shortly afterwards in 1911, and then they went on their honeymoon, traveled around Europe, and performed in Paris. They returned to New York in 1912 and were in such demand for vaudeville and their motion pictures. The postcard that you see pictured here shows the entrance to Halcyon Park, a development that was built in New Rochelle. And the reason I'm showing this is part of the land that was used for it was part of the Brookside home of Dr. and Mrs. Herbert Foote, Irene's parents. That is correct. Yes. Here we see a picture of Pearl Primus. Pearl Primus was a dancer, choreographer, and social activist. She was a firm believer in incorporating the everyday life of the African American experience into Caribbean and African dance. The choreography that she created had a profound influence on later choreographers such as Donald McHale and Alvin Ailey. One of Primus's most famous dances was Strange Fruit, which was based on a poem by Lewis Allen and was made famous in song by Billie Holiday. The person who wrote the poem, Lewis Allen, was actually a pseudonym for Abel Meeropol, who happened to be a Bronx high school teacher. He had to use a pseudonym because he was a member of the Socialist Party. And if he, due to his writings and things, were ever exposed, he would have lost his job as a teacher. And ironically, he wound up adopting the kids of, oh gosh, I can't think of their names. The Jewish couple that were, yes, he adopted the Rosenberg's daughters, children. Thank you. The next person that I'm going to talk about is Ella Belle Davis. She was a native New Rochellian, and as an opera singer, she was the first African American to play the lead role, Aida. And ironically, the first time that this was done, the performance was in Mexico, not in the United States. She resumed her role as Aida at La Scala in 1949, and this was recorded by Decca Records in 1950. Posthumously, a local resident, Karen S. Allen, wrote an opera based on Ella Belle's life entitled The Gentle Lark of New Rochelle. Karen was an avid fan of opera and a dedicated supporter of the New Rochelle Public Library and its local history collection. Pictured here is Ella Belle in a promotional photograph dressed as Aida. And on the right, I have a picture from the directory that shows Ella B. as a singer living at 89 Horton Avenue. I tried getting a picture of the house, but was unable to do so. Here we see a picture of Ella Belle Davis from her high school yearbook the 1926 New Rochellian. Here we have a picture of Eddie Foy Sr. and his family at the bathhouse at Hudson Park in 1910. Eddie Foy was born Eddie Fitzgerald. He changed his name to Foy at the age of 15. At the age of 6, he was performing in the streets and saloons to help raise money for his family. By the age of 15, he was performing across the Midwest, and he came back eventually to Broadway and became a huge star. By 1910, he formed Eddie Foy and the Seven Little Foys, which quickly became a national sensation and were performing on variety shows all over the country. In 1903, Foy bought a home on the corner of Wayman Avenue and Pelham Road that he named the Foyer. The land that once housed the home was donated by the Foy family and to the city of New Rochelle, and that is now Eddie Foy Park. The last thing that I want to discuss is the Tannhauser Company and Tannhauser Film Corporation. One of the first motion picture studios. It was founded in 1909 with his wife and brother-in-law and remained in operation till 1920. In that short 11-year span, they produced over 1,000 films. Here we have a picture of the early studio, which was located on Grove Avenue after a fire occurred there in 1913. Next to it was where the studio relocated to Main Street and Evan Place. This building still exists and contains Tedesco Body Works. Here we have a picture of the filming of Dog of Flanders, a 1914 short film. And this is on the steps of what was Albert Leonard High School at the time, now City Hall. And last, but for the last image that I have, we have an interior scene of the Grove Avenue studio. And what you see are multiple films and scenes being filmed at one time. A common thing that was done during the era of silent film, since noise and distraction was not an issue for what was being filmed. Well, that concludes my presentation, and I'd like to thank you all. And I'd like to have a question and answer period here. So please, if you have any questions, raise your hand and I will try to answer them. Yes. The New Rochelle Art Association, question was, is the New Rochelle Art Association and the New Rochelle Council of the Arts different or the same? The New Rochelle Art Association still exists and still holds exhibits at the library. As a matter of fact, one recent exhibit, the Bauer Jury Show, was just taken down. That is correct. Well, what I do know, the New Rochelle Art Association is an artists-run organization for working together and exchanging ideas. Whereas I believe the Council of the Arts is an organization made to promote the arts in New Rochelle. I'm not exactly sure about the details of that. You're welcome. Any other questions? Any? Yes. The question was about the refurbishing of the signs, the approach signs in New Rochelle. Yep. About 10 years ago, they were refurbished by the New Rochelle Art Association. They were repainted and restored. The images are the same as far as the paint colors and everything. I'm not sure how precise those are, but the imagery and the specs of the signs remain true to them. The only question was, is the location of the approach signs, does a listing actually exist? And I'm sorry to say that there is no formal listing or map done. It is something that I said I should be doing, a matter of fact, to create as all 10 of them are where they always were. If you go to our digital collections online, we have all of these pictures of the signs telling you a little bit about them, and they will also give you the location of the signs so you can see them. Proposed locations. Not necessarily. That is something that actually the blueprint that was shown is from the Westchester County Archives collection. So you would have to go examine it through their site, and you could then also see the locations and the specs, and you will see that not every one of the signs are identical.
Larry, we have one question from one of our virtual participants. Could you say a few words about Emile Doctorow?
Yes. E.L. Doctorow, the writer, it's actually the name of the E.L. Doctorow Local History Room now at the New Rochelle Library. And the room became named after Doctorow after he came to the New Rochelle Library to use as research as he was penning Ragtime. I hope that answered the person's question.
I think that was it. I have a question now, building off that last one. So I'm assuming the E stands for Emile?
Pardon?
The E in E.L. Doctorow.
Edgar?
Edgar, okay. I just read the question as is, and it's listed as Emile, so E-M-I-L. Thank you.
No problem. Oh, we have one more question, yes? I am not sure whether they have that on DVD or not. It's, and excuse me. Pardon me. And yes, they influenced many ballroom dancers and stage performers of the day. They were the first big time dancing stars in this country.
We have another virtual question. Is there a sign by the Golden Horseshoe? That's the entire question.
A sign by
By the Golden Horseshoe.
none that I'm aware of.
And then there's one last question. This might not be possible, or you can tell us. The question is, can you show the places from ragtime in New Rochelle?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Sure. Can you show the places from ragtime in New Rochelle?
A lot of those places can be shown. There's no doubt about that. Unfortunately, I didn't get involved in that in my presentation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all for coming.